Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off from last week. We're still talking about the funerals, and we were talking about the funeral prayer. We said Imam Bahuti at the end, or I should say close to the end of this section, he says, وَيَرْفَعُ يَدَيْهِ مَعَ كُلِّ تَكْبِيرَةٍ, which means both hands are to be raised with each takbir, as was mentioned for the Eid prayer. We know that there are multiple takbirat for the Eid prayer, so it's recommended that the hands are raised for the takbirat of janazah prayer. We talked about a number of recommendations. The Imam goes on and he says, وَالْوَاجِبُ الْقِيَامُ وَالتَّكْبِيرَاتُ وَالْفَاتِحَةُ وَالصَّلَاةُ عَلَى النَّبِيِّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ وَالدَّعْوَةُ لِلْمَيِّتِ وَالسَّلَامُ. The obligations. Okay, so after talking about a number of recommendations, now just so we're clear, what's obligatory in the funeral prayer, he says the obligations, and this means for the funeral prayer, are al-qiyam, standing. And this, of course, is for an obligatory funeral prayer. And the obligatory funeral prayer is the first one that's offered for the deceased, the one that was sufficed by at least one mukallaf, Muslim, or mukallafa, Muslima. Okay, one Muslim, male or female of moral capacity, that they pray the funeral prayer, they have fulfilled the obligation. And in the event that there's another funeral prayer to be offered for the same person that passed away, then that is not an obligation. So the standing for an obligatory funeral prayer, the takbirat, the 4 takbirs that we mentioned. Okay, so there's a difference we have to remember between the takbir and raising the hands for the takbir, and we talked about that in prayer. The takbir is saying Allahu Akbar. And he says, رَفُ الْيَدَيْنِ مَعَ كُلِّ تَكْبِيرَةٍ, and that's a sunnah, the hands moving up during the takbir. So what the obligation is to utter Allahu Akbar. Next is Al-Fatiha, the Imam's recitation of which will suffice the congregation, much like the obligatory prayers. Right, so the Imam is going to fulfill that obligation for the congregation. And then there's prayers upon, or I should say, As-Salatu ala Nabi, prayers upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We talked about that and what that means. And then, of course, Da'watun lil Mayyiti, supplicating for the deceased. And we've discussed the minimum requirement for that in the previous session. And then As-Salam, to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah at least one time. And then it is permissible to say it a second time. The prerequisites of this is obviously the intention. The intention is a prerequisite. And the intention should be made as prayer upon the deceased. This deceased. So you're kind of specific here. I'm going to pray upon this deceased. And if the person doesn't know who the deceased is, they can intend to pray upon the one the Imam is praying upon. If they intend one gender, right? I intend to pray upon the deceased male, and later find out that it was actually a female, the prayer is still valid because the general intention of praying upon the deceased was intact. Other prerequisites include Islam of the deceased. Okay? So the Muslim's not going to offer a funeral prayer for a non-Muslim. Purification from both hadith and najis, facing the qibla, covering the awrah, as would be expected in other prescribed prayers, and the presence of the deceased. The presence of the deceased being right there in front of you. Obviously, there's an exception for Salat al-Ghaib in the event that somebody was not in the area, and we'll talk about that shortly. And here the presence means that they are not behind a wall or they're not being carried. They're actually, the body is there sitting there. He goes on, he says, وَمَنْ فَاتَهُ شَيْءٌ مِنَ التَّكْبِيرِ قَضَاهُ عَلَى صِفَتِهِ نَدْبًا. So whoever misses a takbir, right, now we're talking about the latecomer to prayer, is recommended to make it up as prescribed. And like all other prayers, making up a prayer is like making it on time in the manner it is performed. So you're going to make it the way that it normally is. And the part that is being made up is the beginning of the prayer. So you missed the beginning, you'll join the prayer where they're at, and then you'll make up the part that you missed. Okay, so if you missed the first part, which would be recitation of Al-Fatiha, you would join wherever they are, and then at the end you would make up that first rak'ah and you would recite what you missed, which would be Al-Fatiha or what other parts of the prayer that you missed. And that was discussed in detail in the chapter of prayer, so it kind of follows the same protocol in that regard. If one who is making up prayer fears that the body will be removed, like they're going to take the body away, they are to continue making the takbirs regardless. They're just going to make it up even if the body's being carried away. Because remember we talked about the presence of the body being there as one of the conditions for the funeral prayer. If they decide to end the prayer with the imam and do not make up what they missed, it will be valid. Based on what the Prophet ﷺ said to Aisha, whatever you missed, you do not need to make it up. This was in regards to the funeral prayer. Whatever you missed of the funeral prayer, you do not need to make it up. And this was reported by Ibn al-Jawzi in At-Tahqiq. Imam Buhuti says, وَإِنْ فَاتَتْهُ الصَّلَاةُ عَلَيْهِ وَإِنْ فَاتَتْهُ الصَّلَاةُ عَلَيْهِ صَلَّى عَلَى الْقَبْرِ إِلَى شَهْرٍ. Says if the prayer upon the deceased is missed, so now we're not even talking about missing a part of the prayer, we're talking about missing the prayer entirely. It can be made up. إِلَى شَهْرٍ, right? You have a month to do so after the burial. That's when the clock starts ticking. Not from the passing, the death, not from the prayer that was missed, but from the time of burial, you begin a month. You have a window there, and the prayer is to be performed at the grave. He says, صَلَّى عَلَى الْقَبْرِ, right? You pray upon the grave. And this is based on a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ prayed upon a grave. You find this in Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim. There's another hadith which states that Sa'ad passed away while the Prophet ﷺ was away. When he arrived, a month later, he prayed upon her. This is found in Sunnah Tirmidhi. So that gives us not only the location, but it also highlights for us the duration of time. Imam Ahmad said that this was the longest time frame he has heard of. It is impermissible to do so after a month unless the time is insignificant, like a month and a little bit of time, a day or so. If it's an insignificant amount of time, then no problem. You don't have to hold fast to 1 month. It can be just a little bit of time. But if it starts to creep beyond that and now you're out, month and a half, 2 months, 3 months, no, we can't go any further. Is وَكَذَا عَلَى غَائِبٍ عَنِ الْبَلَدِ بِالنِّيَّةِ وَلَا بَأْسَ بِالصَّلَاةِ عَلَيْهِ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ. So there's two parts here. وَكَذَا عَلَى غَائِبٍ عَنِ الْبَلَدِ بِالنِّيَّةِ. He says here, basically we're talking about the prayer of someone who's passed away outside of the area. He says, for both the imam and the individuals with the intention within a month of the death. So now, I'm not talking about burial, we're talking about the death of the deceased. From that point on, the same thing goes for one who has died out of the area. Even if they're not really far away, like they're not beyond the distance permitted to shorten and combine prayers. They're just not here. They're in a different city. You wouldn't shorten and combine your prayers to go see them. So we're not talking about it has to be such a long distance away for you to be permitted to perform this prayer. And this prayer, praying upon the one who is absent, is based on the Prophet ﷺ praying for a Najashi. Najashi, of course, as many of us know, passed away. The Prophet ﷺ found out about that. He passed away while he was in his country. And the Prophet ﷺ prayed upon him. The same thing goes for someone who has drowned. The body's not there. The body wasn't recovered. Or they've been taken captive and the body can't be recovered. So a person, you could pray their funeral prayer with them not present. Now, so this is if the person's not there. What about if a body part? So we're talking about, this is some like little details. If a part of the deceased was found, a part only of the body was found, with the exception of hair, nails, and teeth. Those are the things that you would normally find, hair, nails, and teeth. These things are not prayed upon, right? The hair, nails, and teeth are not prayed upon. The body part that's found is treated like the rest of the body. It's washed, it's shrouded, and prayed upon. And it's buried next to the body of the deceased. If another part is found later, the same thing applies. If most of the body was prayed upon, it's not obligatory to pray upon the smaller parts, but recommended. It is, however, obligatory to wash and shroud those body parts, the smaller parts, if they were found that you didn't pray over. You're not going to pray over as a recommendation. You're just not going to do it for whatever reason. It is still recommended to wash and shroud them. So essentially, in the event that this might be something that happens in wartime, there are some scenarios that you have to pay attention to here. It's not recommended for the leader or imam who serves as their judge to pray upon someone who has misappropriated war booty or committed suicide. So that's an important note. That even though the prayer has to be performed, the imam's not going to, or the leader of the community, someone that serves as like the leader of the area or serves as the judge, is not going to pray upon a person who has committed suicide. That means they've intentionally taken their own life. This is something impermissible. Or misappropriated war booty, meaning they hid something and tried to keep it from themselves. So these are major crimes in Islam, obviously, and to demonstrate that, the imam is not going to pray upon them, because to have the leader of the community pray upon something isn't pray upon someone's an honor. And so this is a way of showing the community the disapproval of such an act. The last thing he mentions here, he says in this particular section, وَلَا بَسَّ بِالصَّلَاةِ عَلَيْهِ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ. And this is typically what we do here. He says it's not problematic to pray upon the deceased in the masjid, so long as you're not worried that the masjid would become soiled, like would become soiled with any impurity from the body. And that's not a worry that we have today. The process is done fairly well, and the body is wrapped, and it's normally put into a box of sorts. And so we don't have any real concern over it creating a mess in the masjid. So it's not problematic. It's not sinful to pray upon the deceased with the body in the masjid. The Prophet ﷺ prayed upon Suhail ibn Bayda in the masjid. You find this in Sahih Muslim. Abu Bakr and Umar were also prayed upon in the masjid. Radiyallahu anhum ajma'in. So this might not be the typical manner during that time, but it did happen on occasion, and it has become pretty much our way here in most of our communities. So that wraps up the section on prayer. The next section here talks about transporting and burial, the last two things, the last two major things in this chapter. So Imam says, فَصْلٌ فِي حَمْلِ الْمَيِّتِ وَدَفْنِهِ. So this is a section on transporting the deceased and their burial. So transporting and burying the deceased are also communal obligations, as we've discussed. This is fardu kifaya. It's a communal obligation. And that also includes whatever is required to secure transport and burial, like whatever preparations are needed to perform the ghusl, etc. Whatever materials and things that are needed, those things now become part of the obligation. To secure the transport and the burial, you might need tools, you might require some transportation, you might require some land, you might require purchasing of stuff. And so these things are all become enveloped within this ruling, communal obligations. Just like shrouding, the kafan, these obligations of transporting and burial can be fulfilled by anyone. Shrouding, so careful, shrouding, transporting, and burial can be fulfilled by anyone, including a non-Muslim. To be made in these things, unlike the ghusl, we talked about the intention that has to be made. The person that's washing is going to make an intention on behalf of the deceased. And then obviously for prayer, we know there's a prerequisite in general for all prayer, an intention. And the non-Muslim can't produce the requisite intention. But these issues, the shrouding, the transporting, and the burial, don't require an intention, so anyone can fulfill these obligations. Similar to the previous topics, it's disliked to take a wage. Disliked, not haram, it's important to note. It's disliked to take a wage for transporting and burying the deceased, because when you take a wage, when you take a أجرة ينقص من الأجر. Okay, it diminishes the reward. It diminishes the reward that you would get if you had done it voluntarily. So, now that we've gone through the basic concepts here of washing and shrouding and prayer, we move on into the transport. So, after the deceased has been washed and shrouded, yes? The person that's passed away should be able to, should come from their money, if possible. Yeah, before their will, before their bequest, whatever, that just should come from them. In the event that, and we talked about this previously, in the event that they don't have anything, then it starts to, there's a kind of a line of people that you would have to, like, for example, the next thing would be the person that's obliged to spend on them in this life. Whoever occupied that role, then they would do it. If they don't have anything, then it goes to Bayt al-Mal, for example. If there's no Bayt al-Mal, if there's no money available in Bayt al-Mal, then it goes to somebody that knew them, that could afford to do so, that knew of the death and knew them. And then then it would just be anybody that could take care of the expense. So ideally, the person would have some money set aside for this process. Otherwise, they should be rest assured that somebody's going to take care of it for them. Yeah. No Muslim should fear that they would just be left without being buried properly. As a community, that's something that we should take an honor in doing for someone in the event that they can't do it for themselves, right? And look forward to the reward that would be reaped along the way. So, as I said, after the deceased has been washed and shrouded, they're placed on the bier, which is the table, if you will, the stretcher, the gurney, however you want to call it. They're placed on that bier on their back, right, so that they're stable. So we're not going to roll them on their side or anything like that. They're going to be placed on their back. If the deceased is a woman, it's preferred that she be covered with a canopy. And the canopy can be constructed of anything, really, wood. It can be constructed of branches. It can be made of like what they would make little tent poles out of today. And then that would have a cloth draped over it. Okay? The first woman to do this, it was reported that it was Zainab bint Jahsh, who was the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, the mother of believers, radiyallahu anhum ajma'in. Some have said it was Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, and then Zainab. When they passed away, they were covered with this canopy-like structure over that bier, right? So there's the board upon which they're lying, and then they're covered beyond what they're already wearing, right? So they're already shrouded, and then there's a canopy that's placed over them, because when you're shrouded, the shroud, as we talked about the nature of the shroud, the material not being so thin that it would define the shape of your body, there's still going to be some shape revealed, right? You'll still see some definition. And so, because the woman is awrah, the extra precaution is taken to conceal that and cover her. So that is something to be taken into consideration. Most of the time, in our scenarios here, they're in a coffin already. Whether they're male or female, they're already covered to this extent. But in the event that they were just using that bier, a canopy would be created over the woman to protect her awrah, if you will. They say that a canopy can also be used for someone else who might be hunched back or have some type of major deformity on their body to conceal that. It's disliked that the canopy be any color other than white. So after we're all set and ready to go, the bier is prepared. Imam Bahuti says, "Sunnah tarbi'un fi hamli wa yubahu bayna al-amudaini." Says it's recommended for 4 to transport the deceased. Well, this is how you're going to carry them. Remember, we're carrying them on this bier, which has 4 corners. This is based on Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu saying, if any of you were to follow a funeral procession, they should take hold of the 4 corners of the bier. This is from the Sunnah, he said. And this is done by putting the front left corner on the right shoulder. The front left corner on the right shoulder. Boom, here. So if you imagine, there's, it's got crossbars and supports that are going to run through this thing, and you're going to hold it on your shoulder here, and then there will be somebody on the other side that will hold it on the left shoulder, and there'll be somebody on the back two corners holding it in the same manner. And so what you would do was you would rotate so as described here. You would begin here, the left corner on the right shoulder, and then you would move back to the left side. Then they would switch, putting the front right corner on the left shoulder, and then they would move to the back right side. So you could either do this to take turns, or somebody else could take your spot and you would leave entirely as you just carried a portion of it. And this way people could participate in the carrying of the deceased or transporting. The head of the deceased is at the front. So when they're carried head first. It's not feet first and the head behind, but the head is leading. We've talked about the significance of the head being the most honorable part of the human body. So the head is leading and the feet, they are in the back following. This method has been related by a group from Imam Ahmad, and it's similar to how the body is washed. If you remember how the body is washed, it's washed from the right side, beginning at the head, and washed all the way down the right side, continuing to the feet. And then the left side is washed in a similar fashion, beginning with the head all the way down to the feet, so right to left. It's also been reported that the Prophet ﷺ preferred starting from the right in all his affairs. Right, this hadith is very well known to many Muslims, to start from the right. The second option, he says here, so that was sunnah tarbi'un fi hamli, that it is recommended to transport the deceased with 4. The second one is, which is permissible. So the first one is preferred. The second one is permissible, to carry the bier between 2 poles with the cross support on the person's neck. And this means that there's one person carrying it. So if you would imagine, these are the poles, and I'm standing in the front, and the body's going to be behind me, and I'm going to take those, and I'm going to put them on my neck here, so that I'm one person carrying the body like this, and there would be someone carrying from the back. So that is permissible, between the 2 poles with the cross support resting on the neck. And this is how the Prophet ﷺ carried Sa'd ibn Mu'adh. Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, of course, one of the great leaders of the Ansar. Again, the head is in front and the feet are to follow in this same method of carrying. According to some of the Hanabila, they say that 2 should be posted at the so in this method of carrying between 2 poles, 2 should be posted in the back and not just 1. Because if a person is in the back and they have the bier right on their shoulder like this, the body is there and it's impeding their vision. They would not be able to see where they're walking, and so it could cause, an accident. You might trip, you might fall, and what would happen? You would come down with that thing. Right? It's because your vision would be impeded with the body. Their feet would be right there. Then in the event that you're going to carry it like this, it means that there would be one person carrying it like this in the front and 2 posted up in the back on the right and on the left as described in the first option. So basically, there would be 3 people carrying it, 1 in the front and 2 in the back of the feet. It's permissible to use multiple poles, so we're talking about 4 people, but if needed, if it's required to use more poles, meaning there would be more than 4 people, then this is permissible if required, and this was the case for Ibn Umar radiallahu anhum. Like if the person was heavier, or it's for some need, you could add more people to the bier, having more people along the sides. If the deceased is young, it's permitted to carry them in one's arms, right? So if it's a child, somebody small, obviously you're not in need of all that brute force and strength. A person can carry the young in their arms to the grave. It's also not blameworthy to carry the body on an animal or in a vehicle due to a need. And a need would be something like the long distance. If there's a long distance from where you prayed to where you're going to bury them, carrying the body on your shoulder might be out of the question. Or if the person's extremely overweight and it's not possible you can't even have enough poles for people to carry them, then you might need some type of mechanism and machinery in order to lift and to load and then to transport. And so there's nothing wrong with that in the event that there is a need. He says, وَصُنَّ إِسْرَاءٌ بِهَا, that it is recommended to make haste with the transportation of the body. And this, of course, is while walking at a speed under like a jog. You want to be hasty, but you don't want to be too fast as to avoid, again, an accident happening. The Prophet ﷺ said, make haste with the dead body for its burial. For if it is pious, you are speeding it to goodness. And if it is otherwise, meaning it's not pious, you are lifting an evil off your necks. You find this in Sahih Bukhari Muslim. The hastiness should not be excessive, so as to avoid shaking the body around, causing harm to the body. It was related that a funeral procession passed by the Prophet ﷺ, and it was being jostled and shaken around. And the Prophet ﷺ said, be intentional with your funerals. This was collected by Imam Ahmad. It's recommended to follow the funeral procession. Okay, so now obviously we're kind of going in an order you can see here. We're now transporting the body. It's recommended to follow the funeral procession. This is based on the Prophet ﷺ commanding the people to do so. You find this in Sahih Bukhari Muslim as well. Following the procession is a right of not only the deceased, but also is related to their family. If the deceased is not deserving of that right, it's to be done for the sake of the family as a means of benevolence and communal care and support. According to some, following the procession is of three different types. Tiba' al-janaiz is of three types, according to some. The first, they say, is to pray the funeral prayer and then to leave. You pray the funeral prayer, and that's a part of following the janazah. You followed it with your prayer. You followed in prayer for the janazah. The second is to follow the body to the grave. You made it all the way to the grave, and that's it. And then the third is to follow the body to the grave and stay after the burial long enough to pray for the deceased. Long enough to pray for the deceased, and that'll come up in the description of the burial. So there's a process. So here you can see some are saying there's multiple levels. Obviously, to go till the end, until it's completed, would be the best. The Buhuti says, وَكَوْنُ مَاشٍ أَمَامَهَا. So when you're following, he says it's recommended for those walking to lead. If you're walking ahead of the body. So you would go before the deceased while walking. This is based on the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Bakr, Umar walking ahead of the deceased, as reported by Imam Ahmad. So they would lead the way, and the body would be behind them, all the people that were walking. And the idea here is that those that are walking ahead to the funeral, to the burial, are going to act as shufa'a for al-mayyit, the intercessors, because they're going to pray for the deceased. And the intercession or intercessor, the one that's making shafa'a, comes before the one that's being interceded on or behalf of. So that's kind of some of the idea of it, or the concept of it. However, walking behind, like we were walking in the graveyard, walking behind or on the right or on the left or wherever the person was walking, it's not disliked. So there's a preference to walk ahead, but to walk in any other location related to the body, it's not disliked so long as the person is considered to be among those that are going with the funeral procession, so long as you're along with the group. It says, وَرَاكِبٍ خَلْفَهَا, and those riding are to follow. And alhamdulillah, this is similar to what we do now when we load the body into the vehicle and the vehicle leads the way to the gravesite. Most people are following after that hearse. And they arrive first, and then everyone else follows after that. And this is even if you're on a ship. And so even if you're in a car, you are to follow after that. And this is based on a narration from Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah saying the rider is behind the deceased. The rider, al-Raqib, is behind the deceased. You find this in Sunnah Tirmidhi. So unlike the walking part where any area you can walk the sides or behind and it not being disliked, it's disliked to ride in front of the deceased. And it's disliked to ride without need. It's disliked to ride to the gravesite without a need. The Prophet ﷺ went out for a funeral and saw people riding. He said, "Do you not have any shame? The angels of Allah are on their feet and you on the backs of beasts." You find this in Sunnah Tirmidhi. So again, without need. So a need would be, it's too far to walk. We can't make it there in time. They've taken off in a car. We try to walk, we'll get there tomorrow. So in that event, there's a need, and therefore the ruling of it being disliked is no longer applicable. So this is just going there to the gravesite, walking there. Riding on the return route is not disliked. And this was reported that the Prophet ﷺ attended the funeral of Ibn ad-Dahdah. He was on foot when he went, and then he rode a horse on the way back. You can find this related in Sunnah Tirmidhi. Another thing disliked is that the procession be led with fire of any kind. Maybe like candles or something. Leading the funeral procession with candles or with torches or something, unless there's a need for light. So you can bury your deceased at night, and you might need to light the way. So in the event that you need light, it's perfectly permissible. Otherwise, it's not. Without a need, it's disliked. Because this is the way of al-Jahiliyyah. They would lead it with light as a good omen, I guess, if you will. Like to have tafa'ulan, which is kind of like to have a good hope for this. This was like a sign of hope or something like that. This is what they used to do. It's also disliked to follow the procession with rose water or bukhur, fragrancing the area. Doing such is considered an innovation, like swinging the little thing. You might find this in the Catholic Church where they swing in the little incense burner. Those types of things, they're not from our tradition. He goes on and he says, وَكُرِهَ أَن تَتْبَعَهَا امْرَأَةٌ وَرَفْءُ الصَّوْتِ مَعَهَا. He says it's disliked for a woman to follow the procession and to raise the voice with it, even if it's for recitation. And this is based on the hadith of Atiyah radiyallahu anha. She said, "We were prohibited from following the funeral procession, but not compelled." This is found in Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim. So basically, they were told to stay away, but they were not made to stay away. And that's why we get the ruling of it being disliked. Why it did say prohibited, and typically a prohibition means it's something that is impermissible. But with the added understanding of this hadith, we were not compelled. We were not like, it was not emphasized for us to stay away. It meant that it was preferred that we didn't go, meaning it was disliked to attend. However, raising the voice along with the procession is also something that is disliked. Even if a person is going to recite the Quran or is going to make some type of dhikr to say La ilaha illallah, raising the voice, that Shahada la ilaha, those types of things is disliked. Not haram, disliked. Yes, sir. In general. It says, وَحَرُمَ أَنْ يَتْبَعَهَا مَعَ مُنْكَرٍ عَاجِزٌ عَنْ إِزَالَتِهِ. It is impermissible to follow the funeral procession if following the funeral procession is coupled with any type of abomination, munkar, any type of evil. So it is impermissible to follow the funeral procession if it's coupled with any type of munkar, such as wailing or striking the face, etc. If these things cannot be stopped, ajizun an izalati, if they cannot be stopped. So if there's anyone there who is capable of putting an end or to stopping those things, they have to stop them. Because this is munkar. It's haram to do this at the funeral procession or at the gravesite, to rip the clothes, slap the face, to wail. There'll be other things that we'll talk about in some more specificity when we get there. However, if there's a funeral procession and you know, like, look, this is what they do, this group is known for doing these things. On the way, they're wailing and they're doing things that are impermissible, and there's no way we can stop it. We can't help it. We're powerless in this scenario. Then you don't go. But if you can stop it, you go and you stop it. If you know that by you attending they won't do it, like it might be the sheikh or somebody that's like, if the sheikh's there, we know we're not going to do it because we just know better and we have some hayat. We're like, we keep it real when the sheikh or whoever, whatever personality might be there that they would honor and respect, they're not going to do it. In the event that that's the case, that person is obliged to attend so as to put an end to that. He says, وَكُرِهَ جُلُوسٌ مُتَبِّعَهَا جُلُوسُ مُتَبِّعَهَا حَتَّى تُوضَعَ لِلدَّفْنِ. He says here that it is disliked for the followers of the funeral procession to sit until it is put down on the ground for the burial. And here we're talking about when the people arrive to the gravesite, it's disliked to sit until the body has been sat on the ground. Right? So you're going to stay standing until the body is now prepared to be put into the ground. It's now sitting on the ground waiting for burial. Unless a person's far away. If they're far away from that gathering, then it's permissible to sit whenever they would like. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, whoever follows the funeral procession is not to sit down until the body is put on the ground. It's muttafaqun alayh. It's disliked to raise one's voice during the procession in general, even if it's to recite the Quran or to make dhikr. The Prophet ﷺ prohibited that voices be raised or fire follow the funeral procession. You find this in Sunnah Abi Dawud. Recitation and dhikr, qira'atul Quran with dhikr, they're recommended to be done quietly. If you're going to do that, it's recommended to be done quietly. Otherwise, you remain silent. The follower is recommended, this person following the janazah, is recommended to be in a state of khushu', in awe, a state of reflection over his or her final abode. You're thinking about where the deceased person is going and where you're ending up now. So that's what should be happening as a person following. That's the manner of following the funeral procession. You're not flipped on the radio, listening to the ball game. You're not having a chit-chat about shopping and the holiday coming up and what you're going to do for vacation as you're on the way to the gravesite. You're not talking about what happened in school and the grades the kids got and what sports happened in life. None of that. It's a moment of reflection and it's a moment of awe. A person should take a lesson from the death that has just occurred and what is in store for the deceased. It's disliked to smile, even more so to laugh or to engage in other worldly affairs. Again, conversations about work, what's happening at the office, these things are disliked. It's makruh. It's also disliked to touch the body. Seeking barakah. Touching the body, rubbing on the body. One second. So many of the scholars have prohibited touching the grave in this way as well. Touching the body for barakah or touching the grave to seek some type of barakah. They prohibited this. Because they prohibited touching the grave like this, touching the body is even a more severe infraction. Because when a person is alive, you don't rub on people. I mean, you don't touch people. Besides shaking their hand or whatever else has been permitted, like mu'anaqa, hugging them like if they've come back from a journey. That's a sunnah. Those are the type of physical exchanges that are traditional. But like just rubbing on somebody, no. And so you wouldn't do that while they're alive, and so you wouldn't do that while they're deceased. It's disliked to touch their body out of respect for them while they're living, and so the same thing applies after they have passed away, right? التصرف في غيرك من غير إذن. You can't just like, act and do something with somebody's person without their permission in general. Adjusting them, moving them, taking their hand, whatever, that's not, in Islam, there's personal space, right? We have that as well, right? That's not just the concept that you find here in our culture, where you need personal space and like autonomy of person. It's the same thing in Islam. You can't just fidget with somebody without their permission, right? So that's important as a general concept while they're living, and of course that passes on after they have deceased. So that gives you an idea about the transport process. The next section, the author is going to discuss the burial procedures. Again, we mentioned the burial as being a communal obligation. The burial, burying the deceased in the ground, is a tradition that dates back to the sons of Adam, Habil and Qabil. If you know the story of those two, Allah instructed Qabil how to bury his brother after he killed him and didn't know what to do with the body. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructed him what to do with the body, and he was instructed to bury the body in the ground. How do you put the body in the ground? So we understand we're going to dig a hole and then we're going to put the body in the ground. So if it's easy, I should say easier, this is a very important part here, because when it comes to the protocol, the mechanics of putting the body into the ground is where practically things can get rather difficult. It can be kind of a clumsy transition from going up to down into this hole. People are trying to move a body, and you're obviously going to try and take care as to not drop the person. Not only dropping the person, so harming, I should say, the body while it's deceased is like harming it while it's alive. So if you were to drop the deceased, it'd be like you dropped them while they were alive. Okay, so imagine you're holding your father and you dropped him. Imagine doing that while he was alive. You're holding him and you just dropped him because you were clumsy. Oops, I tripped, we dropped you, my bad. I mean, and on top of that, it could be that by jostling the body like that, some of the shrouding becomes undone and the body becomes exposed. And this is something that I've witnessed firsthand, because care and concern was not taken. I don't say it was an intentional act. It was just an act of ignorance and hastiness. Again, be hasty, but be intentional. You're trying to make it smooth. You don't want to rush it to the point that you're stumbling and tripping and dropping the body and things get out of control. So if it's easier, it's recommended that the body be entered into the grave from its foot, the foot of the grave. Okay, here's the grave. The head's going to go here. The feet are going to go there. This is the foot of the grave. And so essentially what we're saying is the body would be situated here at the foot of the grave, and then it would be slid in to the grave as such. Does everyone see that illustration? The body goes in head first. So obviously there's going to be people down inside of the grave, and there's going to be some that are outside transitioning the body slowly in a gentle fashion such that it goes right in. If it's easier, that is recommended, as was reported by Imam Ahmad, that the Prophet ﷺ was put in his grave in that manner. He was entered into his grave just like that. It's also reported that Abdullah ibn Zayd put Al-Harith in his grave in a similar manner and said that it was the sunnah. If that's not easier, then the body can be put in the grave in any direction. So it may be that the scenario calls for some type of mechanism. There's like a lift, okay? And this may be the best way, especially when people don't know what they're doing, is there's a lift. And in most scenarios, there is some type of lift. The body is put on the lift, and then the lift lowers the person down into the grave. The idea is to get the body from on top of the earth to below it without causing any harm. There's no limit as to how many people can put the body in the grave. As we talked about before, what's recommended to carry the body. But here, there's no limit, and it's based on what's needed. So if you need 4 people or 8 people or more people in order to get the body into the grave, then that's what's required in order to do so. The next thing, and this goes back to the deceased woman. He says, وَيُسَجَّ قَبْرُ إِمْرَأَةٍ فَقَطْ وَيُسَجَّ قَبْرُ امْرَأَةٍ فَقَطْ. He says only the graves of women are to be shrouded. If you remember back to the bier, we had a canopy over the woman. So now we're obviously going to take that off in order to lower her into the grave. And so here, covering them, the grave, is recommended if the deceased is a woman. It's disliked to cover the grave of a man unless there's a need. A need would be like rain. Like if it's raining, then you could bring a cover. And the cover that I'm talking about could be like a canopy such that no one can see into the grave. It could be like a tent that's put over the grave. And this was reported from Ali ibn Abi Talib. He passed by a group of people burying their deceased, and they shrouded the grave. They were burying a male. He removed that shroud and said that this was only done for women, covering the grave. And this covering is done while she's being put into the grave, so that nothing would potentially be seen that could be revealed in the process of transporting the body from up to below into the grave. Right? The underlying ruling here is that, again, the entirety of the woman is an awrah, and therefore that has to be preserved and protected while she's living and even after she's passed and is now deceased. It has to be preserved. And so you would keep that canopy up until basically she was entered into the grave and the grave was covered. And as we're going to discuss next, their method of this is al-lahd, which is the niche that's dug in the wall of the grave. So the woman's being put in there, and then once that opening is covered, then the canopy can be removed because she's now concealed behind the wall of that little niche. Everyone clear on that? And this gets into the next section about the niche. He says, وَاللَّحْدُ أَفْضَلُ. Or I should say the recess. That's how it's been translated. The recess is preferred. So the recess is, or al-lahd, that's the name, lam, ha, dal, lahd, is a small alcove which is dug into the wall of the grave. And the other method is known as a shaq. And the shaq is a channel which is dug in the floor of the grave. Or a shaq is made by building up the sides of the grave floor so that the deceased fits into that channel. So the lahd, which is the alcove, is dug. You dig the grave down, okay? You dig the grave down. Here's the floor of the grave. This is the 2 walls of the grave. On the wall of the qibla directions here, on this wall, there is a little alcove that's dug out of that wall. And it doesn't have to be dug like very deep. It's dug deep enough so that the deceased can fit in there. The body can go in there. And when it's put in there, that alcove will be covered with bricks to cover the wall. So this alcove has to be deep enough so that the body doesn't touch the bricks. So it's in there, and it's not resting against that brick wall. Sa'd is reported to have said, dig for me or burrow a lahd for me and set up bricks for me, as was done for the Prophet ﷺ. This is found in Sahih Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ also said that the lahd is for us and the shaq is for others. It's for us, Muslims, and the shaq is for others. You find this in Sunnah Abi Dawud and Tirmidhi. So the lahd is what is preferred. Unless there's a need to do otherwise, and a need, to dig the recess or this laht, unless there's a need to do something different, like to make the channel. And a need would be like the earth is too soft to dig a recess. If you were to dig a recess, it would collapse. And you couldn't put anything in there. If you were able to put something in there, you could put something in there. Otherwise, if you didn't, it would collapse. If it was going to collapse, then you wouldn't dig the recess so that the earth would collapse on the body. You would stick with the shaq. Or if it was not possible for you to dig a recess, like you have a plot, a funeral plot, and the funeral plot that you have is only so wide, and it's not wide enough for you to dig down without going on to the next grave next to you, perhaps running into a body there on either side. And if you were to dig down and dig the recess, you would end up into the neighboring plot. In that case, you can't dig the laht because there's nowhere to go except the neighboring grave. So in this case, you would obviously go for the shaq. And in this event, the shaq would not be disliked. So the shaq is done in two ways, and I think this is more practical for our scenario here, is that as I described, you're not going to be able to dig into the neighboring graves. That's the way these graveyards are quite tight, the rows of them. You're going to have to deal with this channel, the shaq. And the shaq, it can be built up with blocks. It can be built up with like earth. You go down there and you dig a smaller channel, so you get to the bottom floor of the grave. You can dig a channel out of it, pile that dirt up onto the side, so it creates like this little hold, like a little cistern or basin, if you will, that the body would be laid down into. They would be fit inside, and then they're covered with large rocks. So typically what happens here is when you go to bury somebody, at least in our area, they dig the grave and they put a large cement frame in there. So this is almost like the shaq. It's too wide, in my opinion, to do what's necessary. But it is in there and does serve a purpose. And then when you you put the body down in there, what they will do is cover it with another concrete slab. So this would serve as covering the body with those rocks, essentially. I mean, that's what we're doing now. So what should be done, in addition to what's already happening at the funeral, at the gravesite, is a shaq should be dug within the walls of that concrete structure. So the concrete structure is just 4 walls. There's no floor. So they don't drop a larger casket down there that has a floor. There's no floor. It's earth. So the body's still going to be resting on the earth. There needs to be a channel that's dug the size of the body so that the body can rest in there on its side and not flip over, forward, or backward. So that the body could face the qibla. I mean, that's what we're after. We talked about that. So we're after facing the qibla. The body's going to face the qibla. And so to create that channel there wide enough so that the body would be secure within it is a necessity so that the body doesn't roll forward or backward. And then, of course, the body can be covered with that large concrete slab over the concrete structure that's already put in there. And I think that would fulfill our needs. It's disliked to put wood in the grave or anything else that could be burned, right? Anything that's flammable. Obviously, you're in the grave. You're thinking about hellfire and torment. You don't want to put something in there that would be fuel for the fire. It's disliked to bury the deceased in a casket, a wooden box. Number one, they're typically wooden, and that's wood. That's flammable. You wouldn't want that going in there. And it's also preferred to dig the grave deep enough to prevent animals from digging up the deceased, or dig it deep enough to prevent the elements from uncovering the body, like the wind or the rain if there's flooding. And in most graveyards in our communities, they require you to go to a certain depth, so that does not happen. The depth and the width of the grave, they have no prescribed limit. It's whatever's required, whatever a person thinks is befitting. Not only the depth, but also the width. So that's typical scenarios. Something which might be atypical is a person dying at sea. They're on a ship, they're away, they're going to be away, it's not possible to return land to bury them, then in that event, they are to be thrown into the water. This is the burial at sea. And they would be put into the ocean or whatever large body of water, just as they were carried into the grave. You should remember, head first and then feet into the water. Of course, they're going to be washed. There's ghusl, there's the kafan, the shrouding, and then there's the salah. And then they would be weighted down with something. Something would be tied to them to hold them down so that they would sink to the bottom as opposed to floating along the surface of the body of water. He says, فَيُوضَعُ فِيهَا عَلَى شِقِّهِ الْأَيْمَنِ مُسْتَقْبِلَ الْقِبْلَةِ وَيُغَطَّى بِاللَّبِنِ. Here we're talking about the body inside of the grave. It says, in the grave, the deceased is placed. In the laht, here we're talking about specifically, on the right side, similar to how they sleep. Right? Because sleep is considered like the brother of death. Sleep is the brother of death. Alhamdulillah alladhi ahyana ba'dama amatana wa ilayhi nushur. That's what you say when you wake up. That's the supplication. Alhamdulillah alladhi ahyana. May Allah, all praises belong to Allah who's given us life. Ahyana ba'dama amatana. After He has caused us to die, and to Him is our return, or be resurrected. As that's what you say when you wake up, like as if you were just dead, and now you've come back to life. And so you're going to lie. The body's going to be laid on their right side, as they would. It's recommended, just as it's recommended to sleep on the right side, facing the Qibla. The Prophet ﷺ said, it's a must, by the way, to face the Qibla. The Prophet ﷺ said, it is your Qibla during life and in death. So the deceased should be placed close to the wall so that they do not roll over on their face, and then dirt should be piled up behind them so that they do not roll on their back. Again, I described that for the shaq, and the same thing applies for the laht, the recess. A brick can be placed under the deceased head, or you can mound up some dirt to place under their head so that it's something to rest on, like we typically do when we go to sleep. We rest our head on a pillow, and so you would be giving them something to rest their head on in the grave. So this is done in the laht. The laht, he says, يُغَطَّى بِاللَّبِنِ. It's then covered with bricks. And the bricks are held together with mud mortar, and then dirt is covered over those bricks. Again, so the laht, that recess, you're going to dig it, and then after you've arranged the body, you're going to then cover it, close it off again with those bricks. The shaq, we said also, you're going to put the body inside of that channel, and then you're going to cover that body inside the channel. وَيَقُولُ مُدْخِلُهُ بِسْمِ اللَّهِ وَعَلَى مِلَّةِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. So here, in the name of Allah, upon the religion of Allah's Messenger ﷺ, is to be said when placing them inside. So whoever is placing the body inside of the grave says this, Bismillahi wa ala millati Rasulillah. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, when you put your dead in the grave, say, Bismillah wa ala millati Rasulillah. This is collected by Imam Ahmad. And along with that, there's nothing wrong with making dua at this point, putting them into the grave with whatever seems to be appropriate. So this is, you find multiple reports of different supplications being made by various companions that were burying people, and they made dua with what they thought would, was appropriate for that person or at that moment. May Allah protect him from the torment of the grave, or etc. That might be a dua you would feel compelled to make while you're down there arranging them. After that, the grave is covered. All right, now we're going to now cover the grave up. It's recommended to begin this covering process with 3 handfuls of dirt from everyone that attended the funeral procession. Everyone was there. They could put some dirt on there, 3 handfuls. And then after that, the dirt is just piled on. Right? So if you go to a funeral, you can participate in the, you might not be participating in the initial part, but then to help cover the body, 3 handfuls. No need for this shovel. No need. 3 handfuls, 1, 2, 3. And then you bring that big earth mover and just heap the dirt on over the grave. It's recommended that the deceased be instructed to say the shahada. So again, this is the talqeen. The talqeen we were doing before they passed away. Remember, somebody has instructed them to say La ilaha illallah. This is done after the burial is complete. So the person that's going to do this stands at the head of the grave and addresses them. And they say, so-and-so, Fulan ibn Fulana, the son of so-and-so, and they use the mother's name here, as opposed to what we're accustomed saying, Fulan ibn Fulan, the son of the father. Here you're going to use the mother's name. And they say this 3 times. And then they instruct them to say what they left the world with. The shahada, that there's none that has the right to be worshipped except Allah, and that Muhammad ﷺ is his slave and messenger, that he is pleased with Allah as his Lord, Islam as his religion, Muhammad ﷺ as the Prophet, the Quran as the leader, the Kaaba as the Qibla, and the believers as his brothers. That Jannah is true, hell is true, that the resurrection is the truth, and that the last hour is coming in which Allah will resurrect those in their graves. This is based on numerous narrations. Numerous narrations. They're rather lengthy. However, you can find them in the works of hadith. Dua should be made for the deceased there at the grave after the burial while standing. So after everything's said and done, the burial's there, you make dua for the deceased. Whenever the Prophet ﷺ finished the burial of the deceased, he would stand by the grave and say, seek forgiveness for your brother and pray for him to be steadfast because he is now being questioned. You find this in Sunan Abi Dawud. It's recommended that everyone who attends the burial, obviously we talked about how they could cover it with dirt. The Prophet ﷺ, he's reported that he did this. The Prophet ﷺ prayed a funeral prayer, and then he attended the grave, and then he put 3 handfuls of dirt on the grave to cover it, and he did so while standing at the direction of the head of the grave. You find this in Sunan Ibn Majah. The grave is then spritzed with water, right? Sprayed with water, and gravel, like small pebbles, poured on top of it. And this is done to stabilize the soil. Imam al-Shafi'i reported that the Prophet ﷺ spritzed water on the grave of Ibrahim, and he put these small pebbles on top of it. He says, وَيُرْفَعُ قَبْرٌ عَنْ أَرْضٍ قَدْرَ شِبْرٍ مُسَنَّمًا. Here it says, this is a recommendation that the grave be raised, so it come off of the ground, the height of a forearm. Shibr. I should say the shibr is the height of a hand. There's a mistake here in the translation. The ra is the forearm. So shibr is the height of the hand. It should come off of the ground, the height of a hand, and it should be in a humped shape. Right? And this is done with the earth, with the dirt that was removed from the ground. Whatever was taken out, obviously there's going to be some space that's not filled because the grave is down there, and so that extra dirt from that space is now going to be piled on top in a hump-shaped fashion. And this is done to let people know that it's a grave. It's a grave. The Prophet's grave was raised in this manner. Beyond that height is disliked. To build it way high is disliked. It's not haram, it's disliked. If the deceased is buried in a war zone, and they would be buried in a war zone because their body couldn't be transported. Right? So if somebody died in a war zone, you want to transport that body out. You want that Muslim body out of a war zone. You want them to be taken to a Muslim area, so their body is not mutilated or decimated or whatever. In the event that can't be transported, their grave should be flattened and it should be hidden. Should be left unmarked so that they're not dug up by the enemy. They'll be dug up and the body could be mutilated as a way to desecrate the Muslim soldiers and to strike fear into the Muslim army. He says, وَيُبَاحُ تَطْيِينُهُ وَيُكْرَهُ تَجْسِيسُهُ وَالْبِنَاءُ وَالْكِتَابَةُ وَالْجُلُوسُ وَالْوَطْءُ عَلَيْهِ وَالْاتِّكَاءُ إِلَيْهِ. Says it is permissible to coat it with mud. So that top of the grave, remember we said we created this like little hump-like structure on top? It's permissible to coat it with mud. If a person wanted to smooth it out with mud to create a more presentable grave, they could do that. It's disliked to plaster it. It's like with gypsum, you know, what we would plaster with the walls and stuff. It's disliked to plaster it or to decorate it in any way. it's impermissible to adorn it with gold and silver. It is permissible, however, to mark it with a rock or a stone or a piece of wood, to put something on there to mark it as a grave. Or something that you know, that's the grave of my loved one. This is a particular thing. It's a stone. It's shaped like this. It looks like that's our stone. That's our graveyard. You're in a big graveyard. You want to remember where your loved one is buried or your friend. You mark it with something so that you remember that's the grave. It's disliked to build upon it, be the structure permanent or otherwise, to build a tent over it or a dome. Those things should be taken down and destroyed. It's yukrahu wal bina'u. He said wal bina'u, this building a structure. Wal kitaba, to write on it, to sit on it, or to step on it. The Prophet ﷺ, to step on it unless there's a need. There might be a need to step on it, meaning you might need to step on one grave in order to put the body into another grave. There might be a need for you to do that. When the graves become so close together and it's not possible for you to avoid, then there's a need for you to do that. The Prophet ﷺ forbade the grave should be plastered with a gypsum, have any writing on them, or be trodden upon. You find this in Sunnah Tirmidhi. He also said it is much better for one of you to sit on a live burning coal which burns his clothes and gets to his skin than to sit on a grave. Sahih Muslim. It's also disliked to lean on it. The Prophet ﷺ once saw Amr ibn Hazm leaning on a grave and said, do not hurt or harm him, the person in the grave. It's found in Musnad Imam Ahmad. It's also disliked to kiss the grave, to make tawaf around the grave. It's disliked. Or spend the night at the grave. It's disliked. So making tawaf, we're not talking about worshiping the grave here. That's a different thing. Like when you make tawaf around the Kaaba, you're not doing it because you worship the Kaaba. Right? But you wouldn't make tawaf around the grave. So مَشْيٌ بِنَعْلٍ فِي مَقْبَرَةٍ بِلَا حَاجَةٍ. And unnecessarily walking the graveyard with sandals. This is disliked. To walk in the graveyard with shoes. Walking without shoes in the graveyard, or I should say, walking without shoes is more like the pious. If you remember Bishr al-Hafi, Bishr the barefoot, walking without shoes is an appearance of being more fearful, and walking without shoes in the graveyard is more respectful of the deceased. Walking with shoes or sandals is permitted in the event that they're needed. Like there could be thorns, the ground could be hot, it could be muddy, there could be impurity in that region that you have to avoid, and so you would put your shoes on to protect you from those things. It's recommended that relatives be buried in the same graveyard so that it's easy for the family to visit them. This was the instruction of the Prophet ﷺ when he buried Uthman ibn Ma'un. Uthman ibn Ma'un was buried, and the Prophet ﷺ said, bury any of his family that pass after him with him, meaning there. It's also recommended to be buried in honored ground and to be among the righteous. We talked about this as being a reason for someone to relocate their deceased gravesite, to be in a better location, to be with better people in the graveyard. Right, so that's a reason why a person could be taken out of the grave and then transported to a different gravesite, that they would be in a better place with better company. It's impermissible to remove any of the limbs or to destroy or burn the remains. Right, so cremation is out of the picture. The Prophet ﷺ said that breaking a bone while deceased is like breaking it while alive. That's breaking the bone. So incinerating the body while deceased would be like burning someone alive. That's something that you have to be careful with. We recently heard a story of someone whose relative was found dead, unknown to them. They passed away, and they were like kind of like a John Doe. You know, they were found by the state, the police or whatever, and their body was brought in, and no one claimed them, and so they incinerated the body. And they only found out like the day or the day after that. Had no idea what to do. They were just devastated. So that's a concern you have to worry about. Right? So share location. Share location. If you go missing, they'll know where you are. And they can collect you and manage. Okay. The next section he says, وَيَحْرُمُ دَفْنُ اثْنَيْنِ فَأَكْثَرَ فِي قَبْرٍ بِلَا ضَرُورَةٍ. It's impermissible to unnecessarily bury two people together in one grave, or to bury one in the grave of another before they have fully deteriorated. The Prophet ﷺ, of course, buried each body in its own grave. This was the traditional protocol. We do know there was exceptions to that, like the Battle of Uhud, in which there were more bodies buried in a single grave. And that's another reason that would permit you to go and exhume a body, to take them out of a grave that possessed multiple bodies. If you now had a better location, or a location they could occupy by themselves, then you could go and unearth that body and put them in a grave by themselves. That was done during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So to bury one body in a grave is a tradition that's been passed down generation after generation from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. If you're digging a grave, and you can also turn over graves, meaning like you can use one spot to bury multiple people, so long as the body has fully deteriorated. If you've ever been to Medina, there's a graveyard. There's one graveyard in Medina. One graveyard. It's big. It's not that big for as many people that die, because all of the people in Medina are buried there in that graveyard. So you start to wonder, like, where's the space? Where are we going? And so they turn over those graves. And the last thing that I heard from somebody that spoke to one of the workers there said, in that climate, in that soil, it takes 4 years. 4 years, and then when you dig, there's nothing. The body has fully decomposed and deteriorated, and now it's dust. In that event, you can use the grave site again. If you're digging and remains are found within it, like so you're going to use it and you think it's good, and then you find some remains, they are to be reburied. You have to bury them back again. And then you have to find another grave for the person that you're trying to bury in a different location. Again, if there's a lack of space, as I mentioned about the Prophet ﷺ burying more than one, he said bury 2 or 3 in a single grave during the time of Uhud. So you can find this in Sunan Nasa'i, then it's permissible to do that. Obviously, when you're going to use one grave, the most virtuous of the deceased is to be placed closest to the Qibla wall in the event that there's more than one person in a grave. It says, وَيَجْعَلُ بَيْنَهُمَا حَاجِزٌ مِنْ تُرَابٍ. And a partition of dirt should be placed between them. So in the event that there's more than one person in a grave, then you build a wall of dirt between them, so it's as if they're in their own space. It's as if it's in their own space. He says, وَتُسَنُّ الْقِرَاءَةُ عِنْدَهُ وَجَعْلُ نَحْوِ جَرِيدَةٍ خُضْرَاءٍ. It's recommended to recite at the grave, which is based on Anas saying, whoever enters the graves and recites Yasin over them, the dwellers of the graves will be relieved on that day, and the reciter will have the reward for all those present. It's also been reported that Ibn Umar requested that the beginning of Al-Baqarah be recited at his grave, as well as the end, the beginning and the end of Al-Baqarah be recited at his grave when he was buried. It's also recommended to do whatever will cause the deceased relief. And that can be like to place something like a fresh green palm branch on the grave. The Prophet ﷺ was noted to have stuck a palm branch into a grave, those that were being tormented in the grave. This was an act to relieve some of them. To get close to the end here, he says, وَأَيُّ قُرْبَةٍ فَعَلَهَا وَجَعَلَ ثَوَابَهَا لِمُسْلِمٍ حَيٍّ أَوْ مَيِّتٍ نَفَعَهُ. He says, any act of piety, seeking, let's say, making dua, seeking forgiveness, prayer, fasting, hajj, recitation, etc., done by a Muslim to give the reward to a Muslim, be they living or dead, will benefit them. Imam Ahmad said this is based on the reported text, every good thing will reach the deceased. This includes acts of worship that you can appoint one to do on your behalf, like Hajj and Umrah. You can appoint someone to make Hajj and Umrah on your behalf. It includes that, as well as acts that cannot be outsourced, like prayer, dua. You can't say, pray for me, and I won't need to pray. Okay? Even if they're obligatory or voluntary, a person can intend that the reward be given to someone else. And ideally, And they would fulfill their obligation. The obligation would be fulfilled, and the reward of that would be gifted to another person. Al-Majd ibn Taymiyyah, this is the grandfather, and others mentioned that this includes gifting a reward to the Prophet ﷺ. It would reach and benefit him. It says, وَنُدِبَ إِصْلَاحُ طَعَامًا لِأَهْلِ مَيِّتٍ يُبْعَثُ بِهِ إِلَيْهِمْ ثَلَاثًا. It's recommended to prepare food and send it to the deceased family for up to 3 days and no more. Anything beyond that is considered disliked. The Prophet ﷺ said, prepare food for Ja'far's family, for they have become busied, meaning by his passing. You find this collected by Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad, and Sunnah Tirmidhi. He says, وَكُرِهَ لَهُمْ فِعْلُهُ لِلنَّاسِ. It's disliked that they do so for the people, meaning the family of the deceased prepare food for others. Like we're going to have ta'ziyah, there's going to be this condolences. We're going to make food, and then you're going to come have a feast. Ahmed related that Jarir said, we considered visiting the deceased family in groups. We go in jama'at, and eating food after the burial as a form of niyaha, which is impermissible. That the people of the relatives, they prepare food and they sit there and they eat. What should be done is people prepare food for them, they bring it and they leave it for them, or they send it to them. As communal care and support. They're busy with their deceased. They're busy with grieving. They're not thinking about entertaining. And so the community has to come and support those people in that time. He says, وَتُسَنُّ زِيَارَةُ قُبُورٍ. It's recommended to visit the grave. This is reported by Imam Nawawi as consensus on the issue. It's recommended to visit the graves. The Prophet ﷺ, he obviously said, I prohibited you from visiting the graves. Now visit them. This is found in Sahih Muslim and Sunnah Tirmidhi. He additionally said in another narration, it will remind you of the hereafter. We just run out of time. So we'll have to conclude there. And we'll wrap it up, inshallah, in a future session. Jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad.